hot.
It's 5:05 and welcome into a Wednesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Wednesday morning to you. Update as we continue to track the high-stakes race for the North Carolina Supreme Court. Republican Jefferson Griffin, Democrat Allison Riggs. There's been a lot that's happened over the last 5 days. To get a look at where things stand this Wednesday morning, Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Mitch, we talked earlier in the week, a lot of movement over the weekend. There have been some minor developments over the last couple of days. Would you walk us through those this morning?
Yes, certainly. This is a fast-changing situation, so we're going to see updates probably in the days ahead that will change the course of this case in potentially major ways, but at least minor ways. So the last significant development was when the state Supreme Court came out and said the 60,000 plus voters that were being challenged because of incomplete voter registrations, those votes are going to count. So folks who thought my vote might get taken away, who were in that 60,000 plus category, they don't have to worry. But the two other categories of voters that Republican Jefferson Griffin had challenged from last fall's election, both have the potential of having some votes thrown out. One of those categories, a smaller group, 260 or so people labeled as never residents because the voting information indicates that they have never lived in North Carolina. Those votes would be thrown out. And we have seen some reporting by groups that have been looking into this that at least some of those never residents, maybe even a couple of dozen or more of them, are actually people who have lived in North Carolina, even some who have lived in North Carolina fairly recently. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with them as far as what the court order says now. The court order says throw them out. So it'll be interesting to see how the Board of Elections would respond to that if, in fact, this order goes forward. Then a larger category, it's not quite clear how many. It could be as few as 1,400 people who voted from overseas but voted in Guilford County. Or it could be as many as 5,500 voters in several large North Carolina counties, depending on what the court order is translated into meaning once the rubber hits the road. Those are overseas voters, some of the military who cast ballots without providing photo ID. And basically what the state Supreme Court order said was you got to give those people 30 calendar days to show they have photo ID. Their votes would count. If they don't comply and don't provide the information, their votes wouldn't count. So that was the order from this. That was the order from the state Supreme Court. Shortly after that order came out, Justice Allison Riggs went to the federal court and said, hey, I needed an injunction. Over the weekend, Chief District Judge Richard Myers said, no, I'm not going to provide an injunction. The State Board of Elections should go forward with what the state Supreme Court ordered, but there will be no certification of this race. And I want more information from the Board of Elections about just how many votes would be affected. So as you and I are talking, that information has not yet been provided. The State Board of Elections is expected to provide information because it has been ordered by the court to do so. But in the meantime, Justice Allison Riggs, the North Carolina Democratic Party, some activist groups working with Democratic operative Mark Elias's law firm, and some others who are involved in this case, the League of Women Voters, they've all filed appeals to the 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, hoping that the appeals court will block this whole process, hear their appeals, and then decide what to do next. As we're speaking, those appeals have been filed, but nothing yet has been done. So it still remains to be seen what the ultimate outcome of this race is going to be.
Obviously, a lot that you're walking us through there. It's kind of like a chutes and ladders game at this point. There's all of these different ladders in which various cases are being challenged at various different levels. So as we sit here this morning, again, still waiting on some of that additional information from the North Carolina Supreme Court. Mitch, I guess with all of those pending legal challenges, we still don't know when that 30-day calendar period is essentially set to start for potentially, as you noted, 1,500, maybe 5,500 voters that could have their ballots in question. That remains up in the air this morning.
Yeah, that really would not start until all of these other legal issues are settled. The 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals could say, wait a minute, let's put this whole thing on hold until we decide whether this is something that federal law would even allow. But if the Fourth Circuit doesn't step in, then basically the case would get kicked back down to a trial court, which would then kick it back to the State Board of Elections. And once it's back in the hands of the State Board of Elections, then the board would have to start that countdown and give people 30 days. But that's at least a little bit of ways from starting, because you would have to resolve all of these other appeals before the State Board of Elections would start that process. Interestingly enough, at least at this point, while you and I are speaking, the State Board of Elections has not appealed anything that has come down from the state Supreme Court. It's been other actors. Justice Riggs, the activist groups working with Mark Elias, the State Democratic Party, League of Women Voters, all of them trying to appeal this ruling, while the State Board of Elections is kind of sitting on the sideline and kind of waiting to see what the courts tell it that it has to do, if anything.
Yeah, Mitch, there is something kind of interesting going on here as we sit here halfway through the month of April. May 1, if things stand on, I know there's some legal challenges that we've talked about, the State Board of Elections would be under the umbrella of the state auditor's office. That's coming up here in just a couple of short weeks. I can only imagine that might throw some additional complications. There's no way that 30-day period will be done before Dave Bullock is set to take control on the first. Now, I guess a court order could potentially put a pause on that, but there is a lot of different moving pieces and parts here.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, there is another court case challenging the move of the Elections Board to Dave Bullock. A 3-judge Superior Court panel heard arguments on that earlier this week. And the panel is set to make a ruling by May 1st. If that decision to move the Board of Elections under Dave Bullock is allowed to stand, we would have a new Board of Elections on May 1st, presumably because the auditor can appoint 3 members from one party and 2 members from another. It could be, instead of what we have now, a 3-2 Democratic board, it could be a 3-2 Republican board. And that Board of Elections might have a much different attitude about what to do on this race. I think that's probably something that definitely concerns Democrats, and on the Republican side may make them say, this might be a friendlier board to what Jefferson Griffin wants to do.
Mitch, do we expect any additional details in the next couple of days? You've mentioned that the State Board of Elections has not yet responded to some orders from Judge Myers. How quickly do you think some of these court cases are ruled on and we get some sort of, at least some idea of direction before things continue to move?
I think we will hear fairly quickly from the Court of Appeals about whether it's going to press pause on this process. If it does, then that probably means that we're not going to see any sort of resolution from the Court of Appeals for a little while, because they would basically just say, okay, let's stop. Everyone can submit your briefs. They may or may not have an oral argument, but then they would decide what to do in terms of whether to overrule what Chief Judge Myers said. Then once that's resolved, it would go back to Myers, who would then listen to what the Court of Appeals has said. And then Myers would deal with the information he gets from the State Board of Elections. Eventually, the case would get back to the Board of Elections if it doesn't die on the vine from what the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals says. And then eventually, if any pieces of the state Supreme Court's order get to stand, it would go back to the Board of Elections to start some sort of cure process. But a lot of that really depends on what happens with these appeals. My guess is we hear something fairly quickly on whether the Fourth Circuit steps in. If the Fourth Circuit steps in, that probably adds at least a couple of more weeks to the process. If the Fourth Circuit doesn't step in, then we might see the case getting back to the State Board of Elections sooner rather than later.
Obviously, we'll continue to keep track on all of those details. Mitch, we appreciate the information this morning, walking us through all those details. Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. And we do have some updated developments in that story. We'll bring you those details coming up here in just a few minutes. It's now 5:14. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for a look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
Coming up tonight, it's WBT's News and Brews at Heist Brewery and Barrel Arts from 7 to 9 p.m. This is the first News and Brews of the year and the first since the very important November election last year. So much going on, from tariffs to immigration and more. You can't miss it. All of your WBT friends and hosts will be there to have a great time with you. It's tonight, Wednesday, April the 16th, WBT's News and Brews at Heist Brewery and Barrel Arts. A few tickets still available. Head on over to WBT.com this morning to get your tickets. That's WBT.com. We do have some late-breaking news out of the continued discussion and coverage of the election between, or the political race between Republican Jefferson Griffin and Democrat Allison Riggs. Very, very early this morning, a court filing popping up indicating that the North Carolina State Board of Elections only plans to review 1,675 ballots cast in last fall's state Supreme Court election. This is according to the filing, which was made late last night, did pop up early this morning on a court website. The number is less than 1/3 of the total number of challenged ballots indicated in earlier court documents. Another piece of the court filing suggests that ballots from voters identified as never residents would count in the final tally if election officials find evidence that those voters have in fact lived in the state of North Carolina. Why this is all relevant? Well, that smaller number decreases the likelihood that ballot challenges would change the election winner. Appointed incumbent Democrat Allison Riggs currently leads Republican Jefferson Griffin by 734 votes, and with only about 1,600 or so ballots in question this morning, the idea that Griffin would be able to make up enough margin to overturn that 734 vote total seems relatively small. Now, this did come out late last night. Have not seen any reaction yet from Griffin, from his legal team, or anybody else in the case. So there could be some additional movement and details on that. We'll continue to track those. We've got a breaking story up this morning over at CarolinaJournal.com. And, of course, we'll keep an eye on it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:24, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. As we continue tracking recovery and relief efforts out of Western North Carolina this morning, we turn our attention to the federal government, where a new letter has been sent out of our congressional delegation as it relates to federal funding for Western North Carolina Hurricane Helene. To get some details on that this morning, Teresa Opeka, CarolinaJournal.com, joins us on the News Hour. Teresa, $1.4 billion in funding. That's a large sum of money, but only really drop in the bucket when you look at a $60+ billion storm that affected our state in September of last year.
Yeah, that's right, Nick. Thanks for having me. So it's that money was requested, or actually the request was put together and sent off by Governor Stein last month, but U.S. Senator Ted Budd, along with the rest of the North Carolina congressional delegate, joined forces to send a letter to HUD pushing for that $1.4 billion in federal funding. Because as you mentioned, we say it all the time, Western North Carolina went through so much and they continue to go through so much, and it's definitely well needed. So this funding is for the state's action plan for community development block grant disaster recovery funding, otherwise known as CDBG-DR funding. And it comes after the FEMA recently denied North Carolina's request to maintain a full 100% federal match for the state's continued Hurricane Helene recovery expenses. So you've got this on top of that. So that is an important thing to let all the listeners know, that they're trying to fight for this funding after that little bit of a roadblock at this point.
Well, yeah, and we covered that FEMA story earlier in the week. The federal government said, hey, we've already extended it for 180 days. There's really no precedent for us to go forward and do that. We've heard from congressional representatives on that. Chuck Edwards says, hey, there's other ways to advocate for additional funding in the western half of the state. Teresa, we saw just yesterday the Senate Republicans bringing forth the thoughts and bringing forward their budget recommendations, allocating hundreds of millions of more dollars out for the western half of North Carolina. Teresa, you follow North Carolina politics and government very closely. seems like this is going to be a story for years to come, and there's going to be continual updates as it relates to various funding avenues, whether it be state, federal, local funds, kind of all over the place.
Oh, very much so. This isn't something that's going away this year. It's like a one and done thing where maybe they're replacing some bridges and that's it. This is going to be an ongoing effort for many, many years to come. We saw the devastation that Hurricanes Matthew and Florence left in eastern North Carolina, and they're still, trying to get people into homes almost a decade later. This probably, I don't want to. I can't even put a figure on what Hurricane Helene is going to be in terms of ongoing recovery efforts and relief efforts. I mean, they just started. They're only at the start of the recovery process. So yeah, definitely something we're all going to be talking about for years to come.
So taking a look at this letter, what exactly does this letter encourage the HUD to do? What kind of verbiage does this use to describe and really advocate and fight for some of this money to be doled out here to North Carolina?
Sure. So Senator Budd led the letter, and, he explained, of course, Hurricane Helene, he brought that historic rainfall and strong winds to Western North Carolina. And it caused so much damage, catastrophic flooding, you name it. And it basically destroyed thousands of homes, damaged tens of thousands more. And it's resulting in 12.7 billion in residential losses. So just mentioning that and the loss to essential services and the region's economy, dealing with such a devastating blow, threatening livelihoods and all of that. So he mentioned, that they need to rebuild damaged communities and rebuild them fast. So, and also the critical infrastructure as well. So that's the verbiage basically is in there. And they, the letter finished up saying they appreciate HUD's focus on this urgent matter, and they are ready to collaborate with them and their team to make sure that they maximize the positive impact of that grant funding.
Now we covered a couple of weeks ago when Stein originally made that request. We're now covering this letter. Teresa, is there any idea as to a time frame as to when HUD might act on something like this and dole these funds out, or is it essentially just a waiting game at this point?
Yeah, so he submitted that letter, the proposal last month, and it was noted it was the fastest after any hurricane for any state. Submitting that. Usually HUD takes about 45 days to review and approve the plan and finalize the grant. So it could take up to that long for them to do that. So we're well on our way. Hopefully it's sooner than later.
And hopefully some of the pressure from the congressional delegations, members of the Senate, members in the House, keeping some pressure on that will move that forward. Teresa, not only details on this story, but our continued coverage of Hurricane Helene and the recovery efforts out west. Where can folks keep up to date with that this morning?
Sure. They can head on over to carolinajournal.com.
Teresa Opeka joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:30, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time for another look at the roadways, your roadways on a Wednesday morning. A look at traffic with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
It's 5:36. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We've got a couple of different stories this morning as it relates to younger individuals across the state of North Carolina. We start out this morning in the North Carolina House Commerce and Economic Development Committee. A bill there would ban social media for minors under the age of 14 in North Carolina. House Bill 301 would also require parental consent for teens between the ages of 14 and 15 in order to create a social media account. Under the bill, social media platforms would be responsible for terminating unauthorized accounts for minors and ensuring personal data is in fact erased. HB 301 includes several accountability safeguards. The platforms, meaning the social media platforms, whether it be Facebook, X, Instagram, they must verify users' ages using methods designed to protect personal data and will face fines of up to $50,000 per violation if they fail to adhere to the law. The act allows the North Carolina Department of Justice to investigate violations as well as enforce compliance, a move meant to ensure that companies take the law seriously. Proceeds from any penalties collected will go towards the state's civil penalty and forfeiture fund. State Representative Jeff Zanger, the Republican out of Forsyth County who sponsored the bill, pointed to a recent statistic as justification for the legislation. According to the Office of the Surgeon General, 40% of children aged 8 to 12 are on social media, where there are an estimated 500,000 predators seeking to exploit children each and every day. Zanger said, quote, "You're hard-pressed to find anybody to say there's any good thing that comes with those individuals that young being on social media." Zanger also highlighted the overwhelming support that the bill has received from parents across political affiliations. He said, quote, "One thing that has been interesting is the overwhelming support from parents across the political spectrum. I didn't expect such unanimous approval, but it's been clear that parents are fully behind this." Some lawmakers on the House committee expressed concerns about how it will be enforced. State Representative Clara Cunningham, the Democrat out of Mecklenburg County, brought attention to challenges of regulating platforms given their consistent evolving nature. She said, quote, "I'm worried about how we're going to enforce this. Even though there is a penalty, how do we ensure compliance when platforms are always changing structures, shifting names, or selling themselves off?" Zanger responded by drawing comparisons to enforcing laws around alcohol and smoking, acknowledging the challenges but emphasizing the importance of making a strong statement to prioritize children's safety. He told his fellow representative, quote, "Saying that people might find a way around this is not a reason to do nothing." North Carolina isn't the only state wrestling with the impacts of social media on younger generations. Utah and Arkansas recently passed laws requiring children under the age of 18 to obtain parental consent before platform uses such as Instagram or TikTok. Louisiana and Texas have also introduced similar bills, with many states looking to follow suit. So this is something that is rising across the country, and some continued movement here in North Carolina. House Bill 301 continues its trek through the North Carolina General Assembly. We'll track it as it makes its way forward. In some other news this morning, back yesterday, Democrats in the North Carolina House committee vigorously objected to a measure that would ban sexually explicit material from public school libraries. House Bill 636 is entitled Promoting Wholesome Content for Students, and it would direct local public school library units to adopt policies for reviewing library material to ensure it's age appropriate, has literary value, and complies with laws like the Children's Internet Protection Act. The bill directs for the creation of a community library advisory committee composed of parents and school personnel to review said material. Parents, guardians, or residents could file lawsuits against school districts for violations with damages of up to $5,000 per violation, plus any additional attorney fees. The measure also directs the State Board of Education to maintain a publicly accessible database of library media rejected by local school units. Representative Neil Jackson, the Republican out of Moore County, who is one of the bill's primary sponsors, says, quote, very simply, this bill is about pornography and not allowing that in our public schools' libraries. It is about protecting our kids. But the debate in the House Education Committee quickly turned contentious as Democrats accused the supporters of the bills of censorship and bringing forth censorship out of state government. State Representative Marcia Morley, a Democrat out of Durham County, cited classic works of literature such as The Color Purple, To Kill a Mockingbird, and The Grapes of Wrath, arguing that the bill's language around explicit content could prohibit such books from libraries across the state of North Carolina. She said, quote, that's book banning, that's censorship. I have some very serious concerns that this is total censorship. The book 1984, which has been banned in many libraries, is coming true in 2025. Another sponsor of the legislation, Representative David Willis out of Union County, pushed back on the claims of censorship and said that the debate was becoming, quote, personally offensive. He said, quote, when you look at the United States Supreme Court ruling on this and the language that we've got in our statute today, it clearly defines what is vulgar, what is obscene, and what is defined as pornography. No one is going to get arrested for reading The Color Purple. Nobody is going to get arrested for reading 1984. However, you might get arrested if you're sitting in a library and talking about vulgar sexual acts with a 9-year-old. Jackson also rebutted some of the Democrats' claims, saying, quote, this is absolutely not book banning. If you go back to the 1982 Pico versus Board of Education decision, they clearly said it is not a violation of the First Amendment to remove books that are pervasively vulgar or educationally unsuitable. So I feel like we are on the right legal ground to do what we're doing. All we're doing is standing up for parental rights. And of course, parental rights has been a big move and a big advocacy point for the General Assembly over the last couple of years, passing the very large piece of legislation, the big-time Parents' Bill of Rights bill last year, and some of those are now taking effect. Lawmakers still keeping an eye on what's going on in the public education system. We're tracking House Bill 636 this morning as well. You can read some additional details by visiting our website this morning, carolinajournal.com. Where it's now 5:44, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at the roadways this morning, a look at traffic with the great Boomer Von Cannon.
Thank you, Nick.
Hot.
WBT and Tommy D Productions presents George Norrie Live, Saturday, April the 19th from 5 to 8 p.m. at the Booth Playhouse in Charlotte. The legendary George Norrie from Coast to Coast AM will lead an interactive evening featuring special guests Vincent Jania, Samantha Fay, and Danian Brinkley. The show will include questions and answers for George and his guests, a salute to our country's military veterans and first responders, and George will even sing some songs with a live band. To top it all off, Bo Thompson and Pete Callender will also be there to say hello. It's all presented in part locally by Monica the Medium at the Healing Tree Boutique, who will also be on site offering readings at a special price. It's George Norrie Live this Saturday, April the 19th at the Booth Playhouse. Visit WBT.com this morning for tickets and event details. 5:52, welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, keeping you up to date in the high-stakes race for the North Carolina Supreme Court. Breaking overnight, the North Carolina State Board of Elections plans to review no more than 1,675 ballots cast in last fall's state Supreme Court election, according to a court filing late last night. The number is less than one-third of the total number of challenged ballots indicated in earlier court documents. Another piece of the court filing suggests that ballots from voters identified as never residents, there's about 250 some odd people there, would count in the final tally if election officials find evidence that voters have in fact lived in North Carolina at some point. The smaller number decreases the likelihood that the ballot challenge would change the election winner. Democrat Allison Riggs currently leads Republican Jefferson Griffin by 734 votes in the contest from November of last year. Griffin had asked the North Carolina courts to consider throwing out as many as 65,000 ballots from the fall election. A state Supreme Court order last Friday already took more than 60,000 challenged ballots off the table. The unanimous court rejected Griffin's challenge involving voters with incomplete voter registration records. Still in question after that decision were some 5,500 ballots from overseas and military voters in a limited number of larger Democrat-leaning urban counties, and 267 ballots cast by voters challenged as never residents. Those numbers appeared in a January the 6th order from U.S. Chief District Judge Richard Myers. The federal judge summarized Griffin's ballot challenge 3 months ago when deciding to send the election dispute back to state court. So that is the news that we are tracking this morning. There are still, as we covered some details earlier this morning with Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation, there are still some challenges in the 4th U.S. Circuit this morning that are still outstanding. Not sure exactly how that is going to impact this filing from the State Board of Elections to Judge Richard Myers. Still a lot of moving pieces. We'll keep an eye on the details and pass them along to you as soon as we get them. President Donald Trump has appointed former North Carolina Republican Representative and pastor Mark Walker to serve as the new ambassador at large for the Office of International Religious Freedom within the U.S. State Department. The position, which was created by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1988, works to ensure international religious freedoms and makes recommendations for U.S. response when religious rights are being violated. Trump making that announcement on Truth Social. The post reads as follows: I'm pleased to announce that former Congressman Mark Walker of North Carolina, a place that I love and won 6 times, will be the United States Ambassador at Large for the International Religious Freedom Group. A former pastor, Mark was elected unanimously to House leadership and did an incredible job as a ranking member on the House Homeland Security, Counterterrorism, and Intelligence subcommittees. As the chairman of the Republican Study Committee, Mark helped us secure many victories. In his new role, Mark will work incredibly hard to expose human rights violations, champion faith, and help us secure life-saving results. According to the State Department website, the office's main mission is to promote universal respect for religion, freedom of religion, or belief that all of this is a core objective of U.S. foreign policy. They monitor religiously motivated abuses, harassment, and discrimination worldwide and recommend, develop, and implement policies and programs to address some of these concerns. In comments on his social media channels, former Representative Mark Walker wrote, quote, "As a former minister, along with serving in congressional leadership, I am open-eyed to the bad actors and religions committed that these atrocities against people of faith. I know President Trump is a defender of faith, evident by his bold statement on religious liberties to the United Nations. Today, with one clear voice, the United States of America calls upon the nations of the world to end religious persecution. I await the Senate confirmation process and look forward to working with VP Vance, Susie Willis, Secretary Rubio, Director Ratcliffe, and the incredible team." Walker was a former U.S. representative in North Carolina's 6th Congressional District from 2015 to 2021. He was elected chairman of the Republican Study Committee in 2017 and served as the vice chair of the House Republican Conference from 2019 to 2021. He ran for office and faced off against Addison McDowell in a primary election in March of 2024. The race almost went into a runoff until Walker conceded after accepting a position with the Trump re-election campaign as the director of outreach for faith and minority communities. So that is the announcement this morning, a big one for former Representative Mark Walker. He will be spending time within the U.S. Department of State in the International Religious Freedom Group. That's going to do it for a Wednesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back with you tomorrow morning, 5 to 6, right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.